Hey folks, thanks for joining me for this episode of the Embellish Podcast, a podcast focused on product stories, product storytellers, interesting brand ambassadors, and any other tangent that I happen to come up with. Whether you're a bourbon fan, a geek, a casual observer, or someone just floating through this channel, you're sure to waste a few minutes listening to what I have to say, and I hope you find it interesting. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, and I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. If you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com, and I'll get that taken care of. I also generally live stream the recording of these episodes, but today's episode is going to be recorded ahead of time. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or Twitter with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's also a place to pick up these links, episode details, and some one-off tasting notes. I just finished a conversation with Ari and Doug from Mammoth Distilling, and it was super fun and super informative. I can already tell that there's going to be a second one of these in the very, very near future. I'm going to do everything I can to try to get up and visit them and what they're doing. If you have any interest in how whiskey is made and sort of the grain to glass approach, this is even beyond grain to glass. This is soil to glass. You know, there's a degree of preparation, there's a degree of farming, there's a degree of distilling, and then there's a degree of selling. And all of it is exactly the reason why I started doing this, why I started creating a podcast like this, is to be able to have conversations with people who are doing interesting things within the whiskey marketplace. This afternoon, I have with me Doug and Ari from Mammoth Distilling. Thank you guys for being here. If you want to take a couple seconds, a minute or whatever, talk about who you are, what Mammoth is, and kind of an ethos and vision behind it. Whoever wants to respond, go ahead.
Have at it, Doug.
So my name's Doug Burke. I'm the Mammoth agronomist as well as a distiller. So I guess my background with it is I come from a farm that I'm running with my wife. So before distilling, I was farming, and I ended up in the off season, started part-time at the distillery at Mammoth, and was kind of taught from the ground up on it. So I then, after a little while of understanding the distilling world, I kind of started venturing into the grain side of it. And we had a great opportunity with Rose and Rye, thanks to Ari here as well as Chad. And so that kind of kickstarted the whole the grain route for me. So I started doing a lot more research on grains because my background's in vegetables. So it's been also a little bit of a learning curve for me, but I've enjoyed it along the way. And Mammoth has been such a big supporter in that journey, and really is coming to be a very grain forward company, and it's really exciting to be a part of it. So that's a little bit about me. Ari.
Yeah. So my name's Ari Sussman. I'm a whiskey maker at Mammoth Distilling. That's a pretty broad term, and over the past 8 years that I've worked with Mammoth, I've worn several hats. I've been a consultant, I've been a full-time distiller, I've been a whiskey blender, I've been a product developer and a project developer. And really, Mammoth, just a bit about my background. I thought I wanted to be a winemaker, so I moved to France and learned all about winemaking. I came back to the United States and loved making wine, but while I was in France, I was also making brandy. And when I learned that Michigan State University, and I should mention that Doug and I are both in Michigan, when I learned that Michigan State University in East Lansing was creating the first distilling program at any research university in the country, like a real distilling program with students doing research, I jumped at the opportunity not to join the program, but to work there. I've always been a little bit more entrepreneurial than academic. And so my goal was to work with the students that were doing research, work with the companies that would come into Michigan State's distillery for product and process development. And turned out to be a really great thing. The late, great Dr. Chris Berglund, we lost him a few years ago. He passed away. He founded, like I said, the first distilling program in the country, which became a real epicenter for distilling knowledge, especially innovative distilling knowledge in the United States. He was very Chris was from Sweden. He was from like northern Sweden, and he was always very insistent that Michigan, because of Michigan's uniquely diverse agriculture, Michigan has more growth zones than Kentucky and Tennessee put together, basically, and because of the various soil types, because of soil deposited during the glaciers receding 13,000 years ago, Michigan is just blessed with a lot of agricultural diversity. And he was shocked. Dr. Berglund was shocked that while the brewers were doing great and the winemakers were doing great, nobody was really doing distilling. And in fact, at the time, very few people in the country in general were doing distilling. And so Dr. Berglund planted, at least in my head, no pun intended, the idea that in addition to the wonderful spirits being made in Tennessee and Kentucky, and primarily in the south of the United States, from the middle to the south of the United States, that there was a distinct style and unique characteristics and aromas and spirits to be made in the north, and that there's just like a lot of runway for creative people that understand agriculture and understand the science of distilling. The north offers so many possibilities to explore flavor and aroma and all of that. So I met the owners, Chad and Tracy, of Mammoth Distilling while I was working at Michigan State. They were one of the companies that came in to have their products developed, and we just remained in touch over the years. And ultimately, when it was time for them to set up their own distillery and start making products, they brought me on as distiller. And gradually over time, I helped train other distillers who have in turn trained other distillers. But Doug alluded a little bit to Rosenrye, which is just this phenomenal story that we stumbled upon that is in our backyard. We'll get into it in a little more depth in a minute, I'm sure. But yeah, I'm a whiskey maker. I actually I help develop products for several distilleries. Mammoth, however, is very unique in that it's championing the flavors and aromas of the North. And that's something that we just have not seen in the United States. And in order to do that, we need to learn more about grain varietals. I mentioned I have a background as a winemaker, and winemakers know that varietals are very important to developing styles of wine. But of course, whiskey has been so homogenized and consolidated in the past 80 years since the end of Prohibition that those kind of varietal styles, regional styles, have all kind of fallen by the wayside. And Mammoth is really one of the companies in the United States that's looking to hold the mantle and stake a claim to agriculture and climate and land being a critical component of making whiskey.
Mm-hmm. It's that's the thing that sort of hooks me on this entire story is, I don't know, 6 months ago, 3, 4, 5 months ago, there's another podcast called Distillers Talk. It's got Alan Bishop out of French Lick. He was doing
a great Christy as well.
Yeah, Christy.
So yeah, Atkinson's wonderful.
People who don't know the podcast, they know who Alan Bishop is because of French Lick. People who know the podcast also know Christy. But they have a fantastic episode with a guy named Joseph Lofthouse who talks about landrace gardening. And through the course of that, he mentioned specifically that there's no reason why every craft distiller should not have their own grain, right? Maybe you've got rosin rye, but you've got a lineage of rosin rye that you kind of grow because it fits your climate, it fits your terroir, it fits your growing season, it fits whatever. And that's what I really like about this. But rosin rye has its own problems. And so we can kind of just dive right into what rosin rye is specifically and where it was historically versus where it is now. And I know one of the problems with rosin rye being really, really popular. And so I found this article. It said that you came across it because you were looking at a 1934 Christmas issue of Vanity Fair. Like, who does things like that besides people like maybe like you and Todd Leopold are looking at old documents to try to find stuff? Super interesting. But Rosen has a problem with promiscuity, and most of the people who listen to this have no idea what that means. So either one of you guys care to explain what that means for the rye, for what happens to it over time, and does it impact whiskey flavor?
Yeah, I guess I'll take this one. So rye is kind of a unique grain in that it is a cross-pollinating grain. So you have like wheat, which is self-pollinating, and that's really easily you can easily control the genetics of it. But with rye and its cross-pollination, anytime it's planted, close to another variety of rye, they're going to cross-pollinate each other, and the genetics from that is going to be different and skewed. So especially with like this rosin rye doing it on South Manitou, it's away from all other types of rye. The only rye that has been grown on the island is rosin rye. So, it's quite an adventure to be able to keep those genetics pure, but in the end, I think it's really going to be rewarding. And yeah, I mean, rye is such a hardy crop too. I think we're really lucky that we're growing rye on South Manitou Island instead of corn. That would be a complete nightmare. But yeah, I
As
mean,
opposed to growing rye, is that less of a nightmare?
yeah. Rye is easy, man. Rye is one of the easier crops to grow. It can handle like poor soils, sandy soils, and it's extremely winter hardy. I did a little test plot at my house and with a Hazlitt variety rye, as well with a rosin, just to see how they overwintered with each other and kind of the comparison. And this rosin is coming up so green and thick and healthy. And, the Hazlitt rye, the stuff that's been, cross-pollinated, multiple times it's short. It's going to work, but it's definitely not as hardy as this rosin rye. So very exciting.
So you mentioned the South Manitou Island. Um, Maybe it helps to explain how rye pollinates. Is it wind? Is it insect? Is it like what happens there? And then the need for the island itself, specifically around rosin.
Yeah, I mean it's almost entirely wind pollinated. So it's also we have westerly winds, so the winds are always going to be going towards the mainland, away from the island. So it's really a secure area. But yeah, rye is almost entirely wind pollinated. Um,
Okay,
I don't know.
that makes sense now, because I was looking at it and I was like, um, in my experience in ag, some folks will use buffer zones, growing zones, whatever, to try to capture that. And so you use the first 20, 30, 40, 50 feet of a field to try to kind of pick that up. But on the island, you're 5-ish miles from the mainland, but that's on the east side. And so now your westerly wind is helping prevent anything from happening, because I don't know specifically about rye, because I'm in Kentucky. We don't grow rye here because it doesn't grow well here. Like it's not a good crop for the state of Kentucky. But like, what is the distance that the pollination can have through the wind? But if you're looking at from the west, you've got that beat by a long shot at that point.
Right, because the pollen can't come over from Wisconsin.
Right.
That's too far. That's what's on the.
If it
that's the
does, we have
closest
all kinds of
landmass
other
to the
problems
west.
happening at that point. Right.
Yeah.
And I'll just speak briefly about why Mammoth selected South Manitou Island on which to grow rosin rye, and really how we started growing rosin rye in the first place. And you mentioned the advertisement from Vanity Fair, and that was like the looking glass. That was the rabbit hole right there. I, again, as a winemaker, I'd always understood that varietals have different characteristics even within the same species, and I'd always been surprised that folks weren't paying attention to it. Obviously, in the past couple of years, we've seen Bloody Butcher corn and Blue Hopi corn whiskeys, and that's clearly a broadside in that direction. But what we learned from the 1934 advertisement was that not only was the largest company in the United States taking out a full page advertisement in one of the largest publications, right at the Christmas issue, right at the tail end of Prohibition, right? The first Christmas after Prohibition, they took out this full page article. And the article specifically says that the most flavorful kernel of grain which Mother Earth produces is rosin rye, grown in Michigan and Wisconsin. You don't hear in contemporary whiskey marketing any mention of northern states at all, and you also don't hear any mention of varietals. And again, this comes back to the commodity nature of large scale whiskey production. They're not at the scale with which they can currently work with varietals. But back in the day, 90 years ago, they absolutely were. And it was easy for the large scale distillers to focus on rose and rye because it was so abundant at the time. It was almost ubiquitous as far as rye goes. And the reason for that is because 20 years before that advertisement came out, there was a Russian exile, a student who had been exiled from Russia by the Tsar in 1906. And by 1908, he had found his way, of all places, to East Lansing, Michigan, the same school at which Dr. Chris Berglund founded a distilling program a century later. But this young Russian student found himself in the office of the first professor of plant breeding in the United States, a guy named Joseph Sprague, who was also a young guy. He was from Montana. He made his way to Michigan. So these two guys, this guy from Montana and this guy from Russia, are sitting in East Lansing, Michigan, trying to figure out, I should say at the time, in 1910, Michigan was the largest producer of rye in the country. They were also, this Russian student, his name was Joseph Rosen. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Dr. Sprague says to this Russian, he goes, I hear there's a lot of great rye in Russia, and our climate and soil types are very similar to Russia in Michigan. It's obviously not the case in Kentucky, where rye does not grow particularly well. So Dr. Sprague asked Rosen to bring, or have his father ship some rye to Michigan, which Rosen's father did. Nobody specified what the rye was that was shipped, which is why it was given the name Rosen. They could have named it Sprague, they could have named it anything, but they named it after the student who got his father to ship seeds over. And it turned out that at Michigan State University's test plots, Rosen far outperformed common rye. It wasn't even close. And it became quite popular. And within a couple of years, there were hundreds of thousands of acres of Rosen rye being planted around Michigan. At this point, it had not yet been exported to other states. It was all contained in Michigan. And folks started loving it. Then it started exporting to primarily other whiskey producing regions, including Kentucky and Pennsylvania. But we started seeing this cross-pollination issue. We started seeing a degradation in the qualities that made Rosen rye appealing to distillers in particular in the first place. It had to do with yield, color, organoleptic characteristics, the way it tasted, the way it smelled. And so in 1917, Dr. Sprague and some other professors at Michigan State decided that what they needed to do in order to achieve proper isolation distance was to find an outpost somewhere far away from any other field where they could keep they could essentially keep a pure Rosen rye seed stock. And there was a massive survey done of far and wide, and they found that the ideal conditions for growing this Rosen rye were in fact an island off of Sleeping Bear Dunes in northwestern Michigan. And there were a handful of farmers who later became known as the Rye Kings, because the rye that they grew throughout the 20s continuously won best rye in North America, United States and Canada, at what they called the Chicago Grain Fair, which was put on by the Commodities Exchange in Chicago. And it was like any other farmers from all over North America submitted seeds. And these Rye Kings from Manitou continually won it year after year. So it's pretty remarkable. Later on, Rosen rye throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s becomes ubiquitous in American whiskey. So not only Shenley, which was the advertisement that you mentioned from 1934, but Seagram's, Michter's, many other brands called out Michigan Rosen rye by name as the most flavorful, as the best flavor and grain in American whiskey. Later on, when the Hutzlers and the Becks and the other farmers on South Manitou Island passed on, their children did not want to stay on the island farming rye. And what you saw was Rosen rye disappearing at that point, because what existed cross-pollinated, and we haven't been able to grow. Nobody's really commercially sold Rosen rye for about half a century until quite recently, particularly in Pennsylvania. What's interesting for us at Mammoth is that Rosen rye is notable because of its superior flavor, which is why anyone should grow rosin rye. If you live in an area that can grow rosin rye, you should grow types of rye and identify the right, identify the flavors and how you can make things that are delicious and unique. What's interesting for us is that the story of rosin rye, which was popular all over the place, is really centered in East Lansing, where Mammoth products were originally formulated, and on South Manitou Island, which, as the bird flies, is not very far from where Doug Burke is sitting right now. It takes a while to drive there because you've got to drive around several bodies of water, but as the bird flies, it's very close by. So it's like a native Michigan whiskey story, northern Michigan whiskey story.
And so from the gist that I get here is that, the Michters of the world want to recreate what Pennsylvania rye was. You got Dad's Hat, you got Michters, you got a host of people that are talking about what Pennsylvania rye was. But in reality, Pennsylvania rye is really born in Michigan because of rosin specifically, right? When it was in its heyday in the 30s and the 40s, it was picking up sourcing of rye from those locations. Is that a correct statement, or did I go too far?
I would push back a little bit on that. And I would say that the history of whiskey and rye whiskey in Pennsylvania goes back about at least 250 years. And it's fascinating. And anyone who's interested in whiskey and where the whiskey world is today should look at what has happened in Pennsylvania for 2.5 centuries, because Pennsylvania is amazing. They've always made great whiskey,
right,
and they've always been strong proponents of rye. Rosin rye only came to Pennsylvania in 1919. That's when the first legally exported certified rosin rye left Michigan for Pennsylvania, but we have evidence that it was bootlegged as grain out to New York and Pennsylvania beforehand. We found writings to that effect.
So rosin was, you said, ubiquitous to rye for a long time, and then it sort of died off because people stopped farming. So how do you revive a dead grain? Like you said, it effectively died off, but like you have it now. So how do we get here?
You did bring up Dad's Hat real quick, and I will say Herman Mihalich at Dad's Hat was, I believe, he knew about rosin rye before anyone else. And I knew Herman because he had also come to Michigan State University to get his some of his products developed, and he's a great guy, and his products are phenomenal.
Yeah.
So what was the question? Sorry.
How do you resurrect what is effectively a dead rye at that point?
Patience, and people that are a lot smarter than you, like Doug and several amazing people at Michigan State. Nobody's grown this rye commercially for a very long time. So we reached out to the seed bank. So the USDA keeps a seed bank. It's in the side of a mountain in the west. And we were able to obtain a small handful, palmful of seed, which we grew season after season in laboratory greenhouses at Michigan State University. Similar, basically very close to where the original rosin rye was developed over 100 years before. And once we had enough grain from enough growth cycles in these greenhouses, we struck a deal with the National Park Service, which has been operating South Manitou Island since 1972. And they understood what we were trying to do and the story that we were trying to tell, and why it was important that the National Park Service in South Manitou Island, and really the original rosin rye field that won all these awards in the 1920s, it only made sense, or it made sense to return it there. And so it's taken several years to even just get seed in the ground on the island. And that's where we are now. We're growing out the seed stock on the island. And at this point, we are not yet making whiskey. We're just continually growing the seed stock.
Okay. So you get the seed stock, then what's the next step here, I guess? Because, Doug here is a vegetable farmer, and you're a whiskey maker that has access to some land. Like, how do you get rosin in the ground in a quantity that allows you to distill it?
Doug, could you talk a little bit about what we're doing on Manitou and what's involved with farming on Manitou Island?
So we have 15 acres out there, and we started with 230 grams in 2020, then got up to 1/4 of an acre after saving that seed replanting. This next year we'll be doing 10 acres, as well as we got our first rosin with Empire Malting, a company on the mainland. So I guess I should mention that you can grow like a rosin rye, certified rosin rye on the mainland for 2 years before you have to replenish that seed stock. So we're going to be continuously planting stuff on South Manitou Island, and we get the breeder seed from Michigan State. So that goes from Michigan State to us on the island, and then from the island to the mainland to really be grown at a quantity that we can distill. So, like Ari said, it takes patience. We have to get a tractor, on a landing craft, out in the middle of Lake Michigan. It's been a crazy journey, but if you really go for something and really want it, you can make it happen. And I think everyone has learned so much from this project, and it's really inspiring for me to see so many people take this on, and we've been having a good time doing it too.
Mm-hmm.
We get to go out to the island for a week, do some camping, and no service on the cell phone. So it's really just you, the seed, and the land. And
Even more, there's also no bathrooms and no gas station and no store with which to get food.
Right.
Anything that we do on the island, we take out there with us. We take tents. It's a deserted island at this point. It's a national park with some trails on it. So farming there takes a lot of planning. It takes a landing craft like the ones that stormed Normandy, and you have to drive a tractor onto a landing craft, take it across choppy waters in Lake Michigan. We actually take it across a part of Lake Michigan that's called the Manitou Passage, which is famous because it's some of the greatest concentration of shipwrecks in the country.
Yeah.
So as we're taking a landing craft with a tractor on top of it, we're literally passing over dozens and dozens of shipwrecks.
So you basically just described that you guys are literally doing exactly what pioneers did at the onset of this country, right? Because you have to bring everything with you that you want to be able to plant and be able to use to plant, right? So if you're forging your way west, you have to bring everything with you. You don't know what you're going to need.
A cedar, a disc,
right,
all these.
Right. I mean, we're doing it technologically a little bit faster, but like this is the story of the birth of whiskey in the United States as it is, right? But you're effectively recreating it because you're having to go to this location to plant your seed stock. And you said you've got a couple of years of growth that anyone on the mainland could use for their certified seed before it starts to drop off in quality. So how many acres, I guess, how many acres of production rye can you get out of 10 acres of seed stock? Or do you know yet?
So from production, right, the purpose of the seed stock is to then be replanted on the island, which is a process we've begun in Empire Malting, which is owned by a wonderful person named Allison Babb. She's an incredibly talented farmer and welder and maltster and human being. It also happens that we're very particular about where on the mainland we grow. And if you look on the map where Empire is, it's up against the shore. And it also has those same westerly winds, which means that of all the farms that we looked at to partner, not only because Allison's uniquely qualified to grow these sorts of grains, but because of its physical location, less of a threat of cross-pollination when you're all the way up against the west side of the state with nothing but the wind hitting you from the water. So it is important, even on the mainland, where we choose to grow rosin.
Okay. Are there any unique considerations for rosin itself, specifically in how it's grown, agronomically, whatever? I mean, you've got experience, Doug, in being an agronomist. Do you have do you hand it to a farmer that you're partnering with and say, "Hey, go grow this," or is there more of a hand-holding event that happens here?
No, I think rosin this is the first time that we're really amping up production on it, and so. So far yields have been higher than normal for your normal rye. I do think it might be a challenge when it comes to harvest time. It's a really tall rye. It can get up to like 7 feet high, which is definitely a rare height for rye, you know. So, you know, running through a combine is going to be an interesting process. And so I don't really think anyone has a full grasp on the potential of rosin rye. But so far, so good. You know, I have really great confidence in it just based on, you know, it's from northern Michigan. It's a native.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be fine, you know. So if there's anywhere to plant rosin, it's here, you know. So, you know, looking down the line, we'll see, you know, how the yields look, but MFU has been able to get, you know, 45 bushels to the acre, and Allison at Empire Malting is also you know, thinking high yields too, and it looks really good this spring. So um so yeah,
We're
you know,
doubly fortunate, really. We're getting high yields per acre relative to common rye, and we're also getting um, this. Some people think this is a positive. Some people think this is a negative. Uh, Really low starch content relative, certainly relative to corn, but even relative to other ryes, um, which is important because that's where the flavor is. Oftentimes, having a low starch content, having a low conversion to alcohol means there's a lot of compounds left over in the grain, which can provide flavor, and that's what we're going for. Yeah, it's awesome that we can get 45 currently acres or bushels per acre. That's actually really good. That's above what we had projected, but it's keeping this relatively low starch content is a big part of what we're trying to do here as well.
Mm-hmm. So have you been able to experiment with any rosin yet as far as distilling?
Very small amounts,
Mm-hmm.
very small amounts.
And I know I've obviously never distilled. It's not a thing that I've had an experience with. But everyone that I've ever heard talk about distilling, not necessarily even distilling, fermenting rye, is some of the nuance to it. At a very small scale. Is this behaving similarly to, worse than? Because there's the foaming problem where it all, kind of just it you have to have a unique consideration. If you've never made rye before and all you've ever made is corn whiskey, it's a different environment altogether. Is this in the same vein, or is this low starch content helping that?
No, it's not helping.
Not helping.
Using anti-foams, rye in general, and Mammoth, because Mammoth makes northern spirits. We're not
Right.
looking to recreate things made elsewhere. We're looking to explore the world of northern spirits. Um, it's we use a lot of rye. We use more rye than most distilleries. Primarily, we make products from rye. Primarily rye whiskey, but our vodka also incorporates rye. Um, so we're very rye heavy. And you had mentioned earlier that, or Doug had mentioned that, it's a cold, hardy plant. It
Mhm.
grows in adverse conditions, poor soil. This is almost like us in the north. Like, we kind of identify with rye.
Mhm.
Um, you're not surviving in northern Michigan unless you're a cold, hardy person that can thrive in adverse conditions. And so we admire the personality of the rye, and I think we see a little bit we see a little bit of ourselves in this rye. Uh, Corn can grow in many places, right? Rye is
Yep.
very specific, and corn cannot grow in places where much of the rye grows. We can
Mhm.
tell you that, right? Um, so we do identify with the rye, and that's been a pretty interesting. Uh, who thought you would identify from a personality point of view with the grain, but here we are.
oh yeah, I totally agree with that, Ari. I see, you know, rye is something you plant in the fall and it has to, you know, overwinter in just freezing cold temps,
Mhm.
just like we do. You know, we go inside and we go dormant, and then the spring hits, and then we, you know, grow and can't wait to get outside and enjoy the sunshine. So yeah, rye is very much us, I guess.
So I don't know if you've thought about this. Maybe you have. Maybe you've been asked this before. I don't know. But if you kind of rewind back to before you began a project of Rose and Rye here, have you ever looked at like the audacity to do this, right? Because you're starting with, You have to convince someone to give you reserved seed stock, right? Then you have to care for it at such a high degree to be able to create more and more seed stock to be able to kind of get it out there. Like, you're at such a long process. In much of the whiskey game, it's a swap game. It's a how quick can I get something out and then sell it again. It always intrigues me to see people that have these like really extensive or grand ideas of what they should do, that to start with to have such an audacious goal. To like, did you know how big of an undertaking this was going to be at the onset? Or do you like look back at it and say, if I had known this, what I know now, I might have been discouraged from doing it?
Yeah. I think at the very beginning, when I heard about this idea, I was like, you guys are crazy. You know, and through this process, I think I've gained more confidence in the fact that we can actually do it. But in the very beginning, yeah, that was quite a shock, and especially to, to even think about bringing back the harvest, like how the hell are you going to transport thousands of pounds, from an island? And it was questions that weren't answered.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're still figuring out the logistics behind it. But, at this point, we've come so far, and I don't see us slowing down with it one bit. I think everyone's so excited, and, rye can't grow quick enough for us, I guess. We have to wait it out and let it do its thing. But yeah,
too
I
great
don't
an
see it slowing
opportunity.
down. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think you're right. I think you're spot on. This is all ramping up. John, it is significantly more difficult than any one of us would have known. For instance, after our last trip out to the island, Doug and I both had to go to the hospital with pretty intense cases of poison ivy.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Doug, but my arms are still a little bit scarred from that poison ivy. It never had it so bad in my entire life. I was out of commission for a week. Every aspect of this has been more hard than we had anticipated. But as a company, Mammoth's intention is not to flip as a company, and we're not looking for easy outs. That's just not who we are in the North at all. That's not where we come from. Where we come from is, our head distiller, Colin, who's somewhere behind. Doug is a sixth generation farmer in northwestern Michigan. In fact, his great grandparents manned the lighthouse on South Manitou Island to keep as many of those shipwrecks from happening as possible. We do hard things. We are very scrappy. We figure stuff out. So in a sense, this has been so much more difficult than we could have imagined, but equally so, it's shown us what we're made of as a company, as individuals, as colleagues, and as friends. We work together, and we work after hours, and our families sacrifice for us to be able to do this. But here's the thing: if you hear as a whiskey company about a grain that tastes better than other grains, how far are you going to go to taste it? How far are you going to go to share that with your customers? And Mammoth's going to go all the way.
And I mean, I'll go back to this again. You're effectively telling the story of a farmer, period, right? So this is exactly what farmers do: is they don't know what's going to come at them in the next growing season, in the next 5 growing seasons. They don't know, here in Western Kentucky, 3 years ago, or in Kentucky specifically, they just re-allowed commercial farming of hemp, and no one had grown that in this state aside from universities for 50, 60, 70 years, at least not in a legal avenue. And so you have this want of farmers to farm something new. And you mentioned it, Doug, like there's this problem of this may grow to 7 feet tall, and how does the combine deal with that? And that's the same thing, that farmers are interested in solving these problems. There's an frontiersman attitude that exists in a lot of farmers, and I'm not talking about your big scale commercial farmers that are interested in growing millions of pounds of commodity grain, but the ethos of the original farmer, like that's what this, at least this story, and in preparation for this interview, I read a lot about what you guys do and what you guys are, and sometimes it's a marketing spiel, and then sometimes you talk to people and you start to see that they actually do connect with the story that they're telling. They're passionate about it and they actually own it. It's not something somebody wrote up just to sell bottles. And that's what's interesting. You guys are, and it's what's always been interesting to me about whiskey, is that it is a corollary tale. Whiskey in the United States is a corollary tale with agriculture in the United States as well, right? As things get more commodified, then whiskey kind of matched that. We've come into this place, and I think, Doug, you're doing this. You said you've got a small vegetable operation. People are getting reconnected with agriculture specifically. And so you're seeing smaller farms start to pop up all over the place in the same way that you're seeing people want to reconnect with what varietals and whiskey can exist. And that's why craft is booming as well. Right? And I hate using the term craft because it almost sometimes is used as a dirty word, like, oh, that's just craft whiskey. It's not. I think it's the future of whiskey. And I commend you guys for what you're doing. Resurrecting a grain, that's audacious and not in a bad way. Like that's commendable, and it's what you want to see happen.
This is the first of several. So
the first
Rosen,
of several. All right. Well,
yeah. So Rosen is a proof of concept.
Mm-hmm.
The concept is this, and the concept is applicable to any distiller anywhere. Rosen was so successful in northern Michigan 100 years ago because it was identified as a climate twin. Where it came from was identified as a climate twin. So someone went to an equivalent growing condition elsewhere in the world where they had different genetic diversity, and that genetic diversity was transplanted into a very similar growing environment, and it was improved. That's the word that they used over and over again. It was improved through head selection. So only the top 5% of heads would be replanted as the seed stock. So that the entire sort of batch is continuously improving. What this isn't unique to rye or anything else. What distillers, no matter where they are, if they're in Kentucky or anywhere, get on Google, you can find the right apps, and you can figure out where the climate twins are elsewhere in the world. Then you can research, what are bakers doing there, right? Are the bakers making interesting cornbread in one of your climate twins? Are there grains that aren't currently used in American whiskey that are growing in a climate zone that would grow perfectly fine, could be transplanted to the United States? Rosen is a toe in the door. It's the first step. But what this could mean is distillers can invest a little bit in some research and start bringing in, you mentioned landrace, right? Bring in landrace grains from elsewhere. I'm already aware of folks in the United States working with farmers in Oaxaca on really, really flavorful corn that should make very, very flavorful bourbon, right? In be able to impart flavors that nobody's had before. 100, 150 years ago, there was a government position called plant hunter. Have you ever heard of the plant hunters?
Nope.
These are the people that made the original seed banks. The most famous of all of them, who is an inspiration, I think, to some distillers, is a Russian guy named Vavilov. Vavilov built the first and largest seed bank in the world in St. Petersburg. Ironically, and he built it to fend off any future famine, so there'd always be a seed stock. Ironically, he died of starvation in a gulag because he ran afoul of Stalin. And actually, Vavilov's assistants at the seed bank also died of starvation during the siege of St. Petersburg, I believe, because they refused to eat the seeds that Vavilov had gone to 50, 60 countries to collect. So seed banks, this is where we're going to find really amazing flavors, but we can also, as rye makers, I'm looking towards Estonia, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, places that have varietals of grain, varietals of rye in particular, that I think we're pretty certain could transplant very well. And through Michigan State University, we've already begun, we're several years into grain varietal trials where we're making whiskeys from different types of grain grown here in Michigan, oftentimes the same grain grown in 3 different climate zones in Michigan. To identify we're identifying both organoleptically and analytically chemical and aroma differences. So rosin is just the tip of the iceberg here. It's an invitation for distillers to go find their own rosin.
Mm-hmm. That's what we all hope to hear, right? Like, whether there's a bourbon boom or not, like, I'm still going to be here in 10 years, like looking at this and being interested by this, because that's what makes it attractive, is being able to find new and unique ways to make whiskey. I made so many notes that have absolutely nothing to do with this particular interview. Now I've got to go out and find Climate Twins and research banks, or the Plant Hunter, all of these things now, because intellectual curiosity just gets the better of me.
I think this would be probably a better time to mention, but we're also working with MSU on some corn varietals. And this is something that's going to start this year, looking at cross-pollinating hybrid high-yielding corns with heirlooms. Trying to figure out a way to, because heirlooms just in general don't yield as well as, the large, like number 2 dent corn or something like that, so being able to pollinate a corn that has both the high yielding aspect as well as being able to keep the flavor of the heirloom, that just makes it so much more enticing for everyone, especially farmers, to grow heirlooms. There's not a whole lot of farmers out there that are wanting to grow heirlooms just based on yield, per square foot, based on their disease resistance, all that. So I think that's really a unique thing, and I'm really excited to see where that goes, because that could change a lot more than just the type of grain they're using. That can actually change like a food system.
Yeah, and that's because, like, I know I was at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival this year and went to a session that the folks at Jep the Creed were running, and that's how she tests out her, am I going to use a corn, heirloom corn, and you mentioned it already, is by making cornbread out of it. Make cornbread to start with. If that comes out something interesting, then maybe we'll give it a shot at distilling. If it doesn't come out very interesting, but the farmer has to make the decision. Okay, do I plant this heirloom that is going to yield far less, but then I'm going to have to charge through the nose for it to be equally profitable against commodity corn? And so then that becomes a problem for you two as distillers. Now we have to pay 3-4 times the value to be able to kind of match up with that. That's an interesting concept, is getting this mixture of heirloom and hybrid to try to get yields up on heirloom to where it becomes cost effective for the farmer, cost effective for the distiller, but maintains the quality.
Exactly.
Cost effective means different things to different people. So we consistently pay 4 times the going rate for commodity grain to get superior products.
Right.
It's really a matter of where is a company willing to make an investment. Are you going to make it in the marketing? If you have a finite amount of money, are you going to hire people to tell tall tales? Or are you going to invest in great ingredients to make great whiskey? And for us, that's a no-brainer. We're not going to let we're not going to let quality slip. We're going to we're going to try not to let quality slip.
Right.
At very least, we're going to start with the best inputs available, grown by farmers that either it's us in-house or it's farmers that share values with us. Doug does a great job. He's our main interface with the agricultural community, farmers across Michigan. So yeah, this is an expensive way to make whiskey. Like paying 4x for an input changes the bottom line. It just does.
Right.
And it means you can't do other things that you might want to do. So you're making sacrifices, but you're making the right sacrifice.
Right. And I guess when I mean maybe cost conscious, it potentially allows for more farmers to enter into the realm, and so there's more of it available, right? Because you pay a premium, 4 times the amount, which is commendable. That's what we want. That's what we hope as consumers. We hope that you guys are buying the best thing possible. But at the end of the day, there's X number of farmers that might be farming heirloom grain because they don't potentially have someone who is willing to pay 4 times that in the state of Kentucky? Is there somebody that's willing to pay 4 times? Nope. So then I probably won't farm it, and I'll continue with yellow dent number 2 or whatever it is that I'm going to farm. If there is research that can get yield up, it brings down that cost for a distiller to want to purchase it. It benefits you in the long run. I mean, you're willing to pay it now, but if you can pay less, that's a benefit to you if quality doesn't suffer. But making it more available, and that was one of the things I went back to on the land race, is that make more heirloom type varieties available to people to match their location. You know, I'm in Western Kentucky. Can I find something unique to here? And can I find it at a value that helps me still be profitable as a farmer, helps the distiller be profitable as a distiller, and has a consumer market, right? Because you got to kind of connect all 3 of those things together to meet some degree of success, and that's amazing. That's where we want to be. We're creeping in on an hour now. I know, Doug, you said you've got a mash going. I don't want to keep you away from that, obviously.
Yeah,
Because,
I got an enzyme.
I have to go
more
too.
important than anything I'm going to say. So I appreciate you being here. I don't want to cut you off. I mean, you can hang out for as long as you want to, but
no, I do have
paying
to get going.
and it's not me. I'm not paying you.
We'd love to talk again sometime.
Yes,
because we just scratched the surface of some of the things that we're up to.
Yeah.
We can talk about the styles of whiskey. If you're investing heavily in quality grains, do you want to obscure the flavor of those grains by using heavily active oak? Probably not. So it creates an entirely unique style, which we call Northern whiskey, which puts the grain at the center point and then uses wood, almost like a winemaker would use wood in a fruit-forward wine to highlight certain characteristics.
Those were the questions that I had already, I have them down here about asking about the variability of alcohols and what you're making by different grains and how they're going into barrels. But I can toss those aside because we're creeping towards the end of it. And
part 2.
Yes, absolutely, a part 2. We'll do this again, and I'm going to find a way to get to Michigan, whether it be through personal or through work. If I can tie it into work, they pay for it, and that makes it all the better. But
Thank you so much for making time and speaking with us.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. So thanks for joining me tonight or today or whenever you happen to catch this. I hope you found this episode entertaining. And if you did, please leave me a review on whatever platform you have that you're consuming this on. Leave a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media at Twitter or Instagram using EmbellishPod. Give me a follow. You can keep up with what's going on here. Once again, you can email me at embellishpod@gmail.com. My website is www.embellishpod.com. It has all my links, contacts, account details, all of that stuff. I'll be back again next week with another interview. I hope you enjoyed this. So, I'll be back again next week with another new offering for you. I hope you enjoyed this interview. So until then, cheers and thanks for hanging out.